Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game So today we're going to continuing the series on the Konami Cobra, building it up, talking about the silicon, and just what a mess this hardware truly is. Because the first video I did an entire teardown and overview of all of the boards because they came to me completely disconnected, wrapped up in bubble wrap, and separated. And I said this is the most technologically dense, complex PCB of its era. It is an absolute mess of silicon. It is populated with chips everywhere, and they break basically if you look at them the wrong way. So what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to take you along for the ride while I build up this Konami Cobra PCB, hook everything up, get it back into what would be considered an operational state, and see if it's working, because this board had a GPU fault. Hopefully that has now been fixed by a third party, but I'm still highly assuming I'm going to turn this thing on and it's either not going to boot whatsoever, or that GPU is still going to be completely flawed. So starting with the main motherboard, this is the basic brain of the system, or basically what's going to act as the main central board that we're going to connect everything to, and we need to build this entire thing out, making sure that it's put together correctly with no board sags so that it has the best chance to actually function. And there was about 30 standoffs in a bag, and honestly by the time I got done I only used about half of them. Building arcade PCBs is like building anything else. If they give you 10 screws, odds are you're only going to need 4. All jokes aside, try to use them all. I just think there were some spares in the box. And the first thing we're going to be doing is putting on this top PCB with the PowerPC processor on it, and this was also going to communicate with the GPU board. But this really isn't having anything to do with drawing the graphics, it's more dealing with game code and other associated functions. There are so many chips on this board, 4 different PowerPC chips in and of themselves, as well as some FPGA chips and 8 IBM Workstation GPU chips. There are more chips on this thing than I've seen on any other arcade board of its time. Nothing has been condensed. It is just a sloppy mess, and one that we're going to build today. So we'll go ahead and just pop the screws into these standoffs. That way I know this board has enough support, although honestly it is relatively heavy. I think Konami would have been smart to engineer this thing with a 5th hole through the middle of the PCB on pretty much all of them, so we could give the main board a little bit more support within the actual case in and of itself. It's not the worst I've ever seen, but honestly it's not the best either. And the problem is the GPU board with the heat in the motherboard, it was not properly regulated or dealt with, so this gets some bad flex and can actually pop traces internally on the GPU. Because those heat sinks are not light whatsoever, all of the chips are underneath them, so even when you get this board on all 4 standoffs, it can sag a little bit in the middle. But we'll pop this connector in right here, dial down in on all of those different standoffs, so we now have a proper connection between this top board with the PowerPC chip and the GPU board. And again, this is the fundamental fault point for the Konami Cobra. This board likes to grenade itself. It basically just wants to die, and this is what I sent away for repair for some internal traces, so hopefully that is now working, because that was the problem with this board set. It is a very complicated piece of equipment, and it makes some really good graphics for 1997, but again, Konami never really engineered heat management and thermals very well in their arcade PCBs. This isn't the only board that will die because of excess heat. The Konami Viper is definitely going to do that as well, because it didn't even put a heatsink on the PowerPC CPU on that board set. And trust me when I say, if anything goes wrong with this board, you are almost absolutely screwed. We're talking about components that are minuscule. Even with a microscope, a human hand probably isn't going to be able to rework most of them. Even if you had a steady enough hand to change one of these components, there are so many through-hole vias on this board, you're probably going to bridge something and never even recognize it. So we just have to hope for the best as we build this thing up. This GPU board does want to function. If it has a fault still, this board set is just 100% dead, and it is just a parts PCB. And honestly, with the amount of Konami Cobra boards out there, it's not like many really need parts, because the broken ones are all broken in the exact same manner that is the GPU board. It is just a massive fault point for this system, unfortunately, which is what makes this hardware so exceedingly rare. They didn't sell that many, and the ones they did sell basically all broke. So we're giving this the old college try to see if we can keep it from the recycling bin, but honestly, if it doesn't work, it's not like it's going to be recycled. It'll still remain around as a curiosity piece in collector circles. But now we have these 2 boards connected, we just need to pop around the bottom and hook up the last PCB with more PowerPC chips. And the fun part about building a complex arcade board, especially when you don't have any directions, is with the standoffs in a bag can just absolutely confuse you. Imagine trying to build a complicated Lego model and they didn't put a manual in the bag. The original PCB standoffs I picked were just too tall, but honestly nothing can go wrong here. It's kind of just a fun game of spatial awareness was trying to figure out how things work. So we needed these 3 standoffs right here with the threaded screw ends at the bottom, so we can basically go ahead and slot this board in. And anytime you are building a board set, if it's not dropping in easily, just make sure you go easy and kind of massage around. Do not force these boards. I see a lot of breakage on the corners of these things where standoff holes will be completely snapped off boards, and I know exactly how that happened. Somebody tried to go a little bit too hard and they damaged the actual PCB. Just take your time, make sure you're doing it the right way, and it will seat itself no matter what arcade PCB or PCB in general you're trying to use. So now we have this board connected as well. For the most part, it's not doing too much sagging. And just for one last look, this again is another complicated PCB, and this is why the Konami Cobra can be so problematic. There is just so much on each and every one of these boards, and if one single component goes bad, you're not going to be playing the game. And when you have dozens upon dozens upon dozens of components and probably upwards to 500 tiny resistors across all 3 boards, if anything does go wrong, we're not talking needle in a haystack, we're talking needle in a hayfield. That's how much of a pain this thing can be. So now we can actually reseat this PCB into its chassis, and it does have some nice cutouts there on the IO shield, so that makes it easier for us. Did need to massage a couple of the cords around to try to get that last back corner to pop in, but that took about 2 seconds. And again, when you're doing this, just go easy. There's no reason to force anything if it's not going. And then I will just hand tighten this PCB onto the screw mount on the chassis, and then come in with my screwdriver and secure all 3 of these boards onto the main frame in and of itself. Now I'm technically doing this backwards, and I'll show you in just a moment why, but I'm pretty sure I don't want to jinx myself. And that's kind of the thing when you build these boards up. Leave yourself some out, so that way if something goes wrong, it's not completely taking the PCB apart again. And while we're here just securing it to the standoff, we'll pop one of the power leads in, because this thing has an absolute metric mess of connectors that we have to hook up. And in the middle of the board, again, there's a little bit too much board flex for my taste, but there are no standoff holes, so there's nothing we can really do about that. So we'll pop in this last power connector over here on that CPU board side of things, and we'll kind of take a tour around the rest of the board and show you what else needs to be done, because when I said this thing is complicated, I definitely mean it. But we're getting about halfway through this build process, and honestly, outside of shooting this, it took me about 2 hours. It would probably been an hour and a half if I didn't have the camera, mostly just trying to figure out where things fit. And then I realized this metal fan shield was falling apart, and it was flaking pieces of metal off into the chassis. So off camera, I had to take this entire thing apart again down to the bare metal and vacuum out every single last little scrap of metal I could find, because all of those things are conductive and it can absolutely destroy any component. I wish I'd seen that sooner, but when you're doing this stuff, it just does happen. And I figured, well, I had this thing off, that shield is going into the recycling, it is useless and dangerous, so I figured I would vacuum things out. Because I'm not too close to the PCB, I have no issues vacuuming here. Some people think that the static pressure and electricity from a vacuum could damage a PCB, but I'm about 3 inches away, so I'm really not concerned whatsoever. Some compressed air and some spinning fans, this thing is getting cleaner. I didn't spend the entirety of my time trying to clean this board to pristine, because like I said, I still believe that we have like a less than 5% chance of this board actually ever functioning again. This is just more for fun to talk about how complex arcade hardware could be back in the day, but I figured we'd clean it while we're here. Now, well, one thing I did, which I technically shouldn't have, but I felt like it was jinxing myself, is I did not mount the hard drive in its carrier underneath the motherboard. There's a good chance that this hard drive is dead, and I'll have to move over to some sort of solid state situation to be able to test this, but you'll see we hook up the Molex power as well as the ribbon cable so we can use it. And anytime you're dealing with hard drive games and arcades, just assume the hard drive is not going to work, and if it's buried underneath everything, don't put it in until you know it does work. These are the standoffs I was left with. Maybe they're extras, maybe I just didn't do it right. Honestly, there's not really a manual on how to assemble these things. Now we need to transport some power from the main PCB up to the GPU PCB, and the good thing is these connectors are keyed and the cabling is identical on one side to the other, because when I looked at the actual manual for this game, it gave me wiring diagrams from the main front of the PCB to the power supply and to the controls, but there are no wiring diagrams internally. So if this harness had cable switching over, I'd have to probe out the entire board to make sure the signal integrity was correct, so I wasn't wasn't sending power to the wrong spot, because that's a mistake you only get to make once. The second time the board is dead and you're not going to be able to make it again. And the good thing is all of these connectors are keyed, so you can't put them in the wrong direction. That is always nice, because sometimes they didn't actually use keyed connectors on PCBs, so you really have to check every signal the entire way down the line to make sure that you don't let the magic smoke escape. But now we have all of the internal wiring set up for the Konami Cobra PCB, but we still have a lot to do, because there's an absolute metric crap ton of cables that you're going to have to hook in for video, for audio, as well as from power to the power supply feeding into the PCB. This is what I have left over that I still need to wire up, so this is definitely going to be a two-parter, and I promise I'll actually turn this thing on in the next one so you can see whether or not I light my house on fire, electrocute myself, or let the magic smoke escape. We still got a mess to deal with. This again is just a complicated PCB that probably still doesn't work, but I can't help myself. I want to see if we can make it live. For that, I'll see you guys next time. Hope you enjoyed the video. Bye bye.